Hello, my name is James Anderson, 33 years old. I live in Austin, Texas in a small apartment on the 7th floor of an old building where the smell of roasted coffee from the shop down the street wafts through my window every morning. I'm an education consultant, a job that sounds fancy but is really just about helping schools optimize their curricula and find ways to balance tight budgets with the grand dreams of students. It's not a glamorous job, but it makes me feel like I'm doing something kind, something right. Perhaps that's why I refuse to step into the empire my father and brother run. Anderson Global, a name that sounds so cold even though it used to be Prescott Dynamics, my grandfather Henry Prescott's company. I'm not the type to dwell on the past, but if I don't tell you about it, you won't understand why my heart always feels like it's being squeezed by something nameless. Austin, this city of oak-lined streets and lively music nights, was once the place where I grew up in the loving arms of my mother and the stern guidance of my grandfather. But now it's just a mirror reflecting the cracks in my family. Cracks I've tried to mend so many times but never could. Let me tell you about my family, about the people who shaped my life, and about the secret that's smoldering awaiting for the day it explodes. Austin in 2025 is no longer the small, artsy town I once knew. It's become a tech hub, with gleaming glass buildings and streets perpetually clogged with Teslas. In downtown, the headquarters of Anderson Global, formerly Prescott Dynamics, stands tall like a symbol of power. That building with its deep blue glass and the cold-etched A logo was once my grandfather Henry Prescott's pride and joy. He built Prescott Dynamics from nothing, turning it into a beacon of ethics and sustainability. The company focused on infrastructure and clean energy, from next-generation solar panels to water recycling projects for arid regions. My grandfather always said, making money isn't hard, but making money while keeping your conscience is the real challenge. I remember when I was a kid when he'd take me and my brother Michael through the company's polished hallways. He'd point at the photos on the walls, projects in Africa, solar plants in Nevada, and tell us about the responsibility of a businessman. You boys must remember, he'd say, his voice deep and solid as stone. Money is a tool, not a goal. I, just an 8-year-old kid, would nod eagerly even if I didn't fully understand. But Michael, my older brother, would just give a faint smile, his eyes already glinting with the ambition I'd only recognize years later. In 2020, everything changed. My grandfather went missing. He was on a hunting trip in Colorado, a place he'd often go to talk to nature, as he used to say. He didn't come back. The police were called, helicopters scoured the mountains, and rescue teams searched every cave, but there was no trace. No body, no clues, just the wool cap he always wore found by a shallow stream. They concluded he was dead, maybe attacked by a wild animal or fallen into a ravine. I never believed it. Henry Prescott wasn't the kind of man who just vanished. He was a man of discipline, of plans, of carefully calculated steps. But I was the only one in the family who didn't accept that story, and because of that I became the outsider. I'm not the type who fits in at wine-soaked galas or boardroom meetings. I prefer quiet mornings, reading in my small apartment, or sitting with my mother, listening to her stories about her youth when she and my grandfather planted the first oak trees in our family garden. I studied education at the University of Texas, graduated with honors, but instead of joining Prescott Dynamics as my father and brother expected, I chose my own path. My father, Robert Anderson, called it betrayal. My brother, Michael, was blunter. You're an idiot, James. You've got an empire in your hands and you choose to do the work of dreamers. I don't blame them. My father and Michael have their reasons for thinking that way. Prescott Dynamics, or Anderson Global now, is a money-making machine. But I started noticing the stains, dirty projects creeping into the company after my grandfather's disappearance. Shady deals with politicians, factories failing environmental standards, money from unclear sources. I once argued with my father during a family dinner when he bragged about an oil drilling project in Alaska. Dad, Grandpa would never have agreed to this, I said, my voice trembling with anger. He just looked at me, his eyes cold as steel. Henry's dead, James. This is my time. I left the house that night with a suitcase of clothes and a heavy heart. Since then I've lived on my own, only occasionally visiting my mother, the only person in the family who still ties me to what I once called home. My father, Robert Anderson, whose real name is Ricardo Vargas, is a man full of contradictions. He came from Colombia, immigrating to the U.S. as a young man with dreams of a better life and a sharp mind. My grandfather, Henry, saw his talent when he was just a young engineer working on a small Prescott Dynamics project. Grandpa mentored him, gave him opportunities to rise, and eventually gave him my mother, Eleanor Prescott, in marriage, despite the objections of the entire Prescott clan. Ricardo is a man of the future, Grandpa once said. He's got fire in his eyes. My father didn't let Grandpa down, at least in the early years. He worked day and night turning Grandpa's ideas into reality. But when my mother gave birth to me and Michael, something in him changed. I still remember the look in his eyes when Grandpa announced his retirement plans, intending to hand over control to an independent board rather than a single person. My father didn't say anything, but his hand gripped his wine glass so tightly I thought it would shatter. After Grandpa went missing, my father quickly took control. He renamed the company Anderson Global, erasing Grandpa's legacy. The photos of projects in Africa disappeared from the hallways. The values Grandpa had set, ethics, sustainability, were replaced with new words: profit, expansion, power. I look at my father and wonder where the man who knelt to propose to my mother, who held me and Michael in his arms, has gone. Now, about my mother. To describe her, I picture a shimmering glass flower, beautiful but fragile, though she'd never admit it. Eleanor Prescott Anderson, the only daughter of Henry Prescott, grew up under her father's protective wing. She's kind, loves nature, and has a heart so big it feels like it doesn't belong in this world. When she married my father, many in the Prescott family objected, calling him an opportunistic immigrant, but she didn't care. Love doesn't need a resume, she once told me when I was a kid and asked why she chose him. But after Grandpa went missing, she changed. She became quiet, her eyes always tinged with sadness. She spoke less, smiled less, and her health began to fade. I know she misses Grandpa, her father, who was not just the family's pillar but her closest confidant. Every time I visit, she sits by the window looking out at the now withered garden and tells me stories about him. "James, your grandfather was a special man," she says, her voice trembling. "He'd never abandon us." I want to believe her, but 5 years is a long time. Still, every time I look into her eyes, I see a faint spark of hope, as if she knows something I don't. Michael, my brother, is 2 years older than me, but the gap between us feels like a century. Michael is a carbon copy of our father, ambitious, cold, and always able to bend others to his will. When we were kids, we were close. He taught me how to tie a tie, throw a baseball, and get back up after a fall. But as we grew up, Michael changed. He started looking at me with disdain as if I were weak, unworthy of the Anderson name. Michael joined Prescott Dynamics right after college. He quickly became our father's right-hand man, and when Grandpa went missing, he was the first to support renaming the company. "Prescott is the past," he said at a family meeting, his voice sharp as a knife. "Anderson is the future." I tried to argue, but he just smirked. "James, you don't understand how the world works. Michael doesn't just want power. He craves recognition to stand above everyone. I know he's preparing for a big move, a global IPO for Anderson Global that will catapult him and our father to the top of the financial elite. But every time I look into his eyes, I see an emptiness where family love used to be. And then there's the man I admire most, my grandfather, Henry Prescott. He was a man all of Austin respected. At 75, he was still tall with white hair and eyes sharp as a hawk's. He wasn't just the founder of Prescott Dynamics, he was a symbol of integrity. He turned down dozens of lucrative contracts because they didn't align with his values. "Money can buy a lot," he'd say, "but it can't buy a good night's sleep." The day he went missing, my world collapsed. I remember that morning when my father got the call from the rescue team. He sank into a chair, his face pale, but I saw no tears. Michael was busy on the phone with lawyers and the board. Only my mother cried, sobbing so hard I had to hold her tightly to keep her from collapsing. The police searched for weeks but found nothing. The headlines blared, "Prescott Dynamics founder mysteriously disappears." Then they declared him dead. But I don't believe it, I can't. In the nights after his disappearance, I'd dream of him covered in wounds calling for help. I'd run toward him, but the closer I got, the farther he seemed. I'd wake up sweating, my heart pounding. I've asked myself countless times, is he really dead? And if he's alive, where is he? Why hasn't he come back? These questions haunt me day after day, and I can't find the answers. My family, or rather what remains of it, fell apart the day my grandfather went missing. My father and Michael seized the opportunity to transform Prescott Dynamics into Anderson Global as if they wanted to erase every trace of him. My mother, Eleanor, sank deeper into her grief while I became an outcast, pushed to the sidelines by the very people I loved most. But I couldn't just stand by. I couldn't let everything continue to slide into darkness. In the months following my grandfather's disappearance, I began to realize that my father and Michael didn't just want to run the company, they wanted to own it, completely and absolutely. I still remember the first shareholders meeting I attended just weeks after the rescue team called off the search for my grandfather. I went there hoping to hear a clear plan, a commitment that the company would carry on his mission. Instead, I witnessed a carefully staged performance. My father stood at the podium dressed in a sleek black suit, his voice deep and commanding. Prescott Dynamics has entered a new era, he declared, his gaze sweeping over the crowd of shareholders like a king addressing his subjects. We will expand. We will go global. And to do that, we need a new name. Anderson Global. The room erupted in applause. I sat in the back row clenching my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. Michael stood beside my father wearing a smug smile as if this was the moment he'd been waiting for his entire life. I wanted to stand up, to shout that they were betraying my grandfather, betraying the values this company was built on. But I couldn't. I just sat there, powerless, watching my father and brother erase my grandfather's legacy with a new name. After the meeting, Michael approached me still with that faint smile. "James, you're too late," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "This isn't a place for dreamers." I didn't respond. I just stood up and walked away carrying a burning anger in my chest. On the drive home, I thought about my grandfather, about his sharp eyes and warm, steady voice. He would never have let this happen. But he wasn't here anymore. Anderson Global didn't take long to reveal its true face. Just a few months later, I started hearing rumors about the company's new projects. Projects my grandfather would have called crimes. A petrochemical plant in Louisiana dumping untreated waste straight into the river. A logging contract in the Amazon despite the company's previous commitments to environmental protection. And then an oil drilling project in Alaska, the one my father proudly boasted about at a family dinner, as if it were his greatest achievement. I couldn't stay silent. That evening at the sprawling family home in the Austin suburbs, I confronted my father. My mother sat at the head of the table quietly stirring her cold soup. Michael sipped his wine, his eyes fixed on me as if waiting to see what I'd do. "Dad, Grandpa would never have agreed to the Alaska project," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It goes against everything Prescott Dynamics stood for." My father set down his wine glass and looked at me with icy eyes. "Henry's not here anymore. I'm running the company now, and I know how to make money." Make money by destroying the environment? By cozying up to corrupt politicians? I couldn't hold back anymore. "Do you even know the cost of those deals?" Michael let out a dry laugh. "James, you're such an idiot. The world doesn't run on your lofty ideals. Money is king, and we're doing what's necessary to keep this company at the top." My mother looked up, her eyes misty with tears. "James, stop talking," she whispered. "Just let it go." But I couldn't. "Mom, I can't let them destroy Grandpa's legacy. I can't just stand by and watch." My father slammed the table, making the dishes rattle. "Enough, James. If you don't want to be part of this family, then get out. I don't need a son who's always living in some moral fantasy." I stood up, my heart feeling like it was being crushed. My mother reached for me, but I shook my head. "I'm sorry, Mom. I can't stay." I drove back to my apartment, tears streaming down my face. I wasn't crying because of my father's words, but because I felt like I'd lost everything. My family, my grandfather, and the belief that things would ever be okay again. In the years that followed, I lived like a shadow. I worked, met friends, but there was always an emptiness inside me that I couldn't fill. I rarely went home, only occasionally visiting my mother, who grew frilier with each passing day. Every time I saw her, I could feel her pain. The pain of a woman who had lost her father and been abandoned by her husband and eldest son in her own home. One time when I visited, she took my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. "James, do you ever think your grandfather might still be alive?" she asked, her voice as faint as a passing breeze. I froze. "Mom, what are you saying?" She looked out at the withered garden, her eyes distant. "Henry was a strong man. He couldn't just vanish like that. Something's not right, James." "I know it." I squeezed her hand, my heart pounding. "I think so too, Mom, but I don't know what to do. No one believes me." She turned to look at me, a rare spark of hope in her eyes. "You're my hope, James. You have to find the truth." Her words lit a small fire inside me. I started digging into old information about my grandfather's disappearance. I reread newspaper articles, police reports, and the notes I'd kept from 5 years ago. Everything pointed to one conclusion. No body, no concrete evidence. Just as Will Cap, found too perfectly by the stream, as if someone wanted it to be found. I began to suspect something. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. I needed proof, and I didn't know where to start. While I was lost in unanswered questions, Anderson Global kept growing. My father and Michael appeared in the headlines, praised as visionary leaders. But I knew the truth. I heard rumors from my grandfather's old colleagues, people who had been fired or forced to resign. They talked about large sums of money being transferred overseas, deals signed in the shadows, and shady connections with powerful politicians. I tried reaching out to a few of them, but most refused to talk. "James, you don't understand," one of my grandfather's old friends whispered over the phone. "This company isn't Henry's anymore. You need to be careful." Careful? I wasn't afraid, but I was alone. Every time I tried to talk to Michael, he'd just smirk and call me paranoid. One time, in a rare moment when he agreed to meet me at a cafe in downtown Austin, I asked him directly, "Michael, do you know anything about Grandpa? Is there something you're hiding from me?" He looked at me, his eyes cold as ice. "James, you need to grow up. He's dead. It happens. People die and the world keeps spinning. If you want to live in the past forever, go ahead, but don't drag me and Dad down with you." I left that cafe feeling like I'd been stabbed in the heart. Michael wasn't just my brother. He used to be my best friend. But now he looked at me like I was an enemy. Then, on a late October night, everything changed. I was sitting in my apartment, the light from the desk lamp illuminating the pile of papers in front of me. Outside, a gentle rain pattered down, blurring the glass window. The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, making me jump. I glanced at the clock, nearly 10 p.m. Who would come at this hour? I wasn't expecting anyone, and my friends knew I didn't like being disturbed at night. I stood up, my heart pounding inexplicably fast. I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. A man stood there, his head covered by a hood, his face obscured in shadow. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob, but then I opened the door even though a part of me wanted to turn back and pretend I hadn't heard anything. The man looked up, and as the hallway light hit his face, I felt the blood in my veins freeze. Silver white hair, hawk-like eyes though now clouded by time and suffering. It was my grandfather, Henry Prescott. "James," he said, his voice low and hoarse as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. "Can you let me in?" I stood frozen, unable to believe my eyes. "Grandpa," I stammered, feeling the ground beneath me give way. "You're alive." He smiled, a tired but warm smile. "Let's go inside, James. We have a lot to talk about." I led him into the apartment, still in shock. My grandfather sat down in the old armchair, taking off his hood to reveal a gaunt face etched with new wrinkles. He wore a worn wool coat, no longer the polished man in a suit I knew from Prescott Dynamics. But his eyes, those eyes were still sharp, still full of resolve, as if nothing in the world could break him. I brewed a cup of hot tea and placed it in front of him, my hands trembling so much that I spilled a little on the table. "Grandpa, where have you been for the past 5 years?" I asked, my voice choking. "Everyone said you were dead. I tried to find you, but—" He raised a hand, signaling me to stop. "James, I know you never gave up. That's why I'm here tonight." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself to tell a story he'd kept buried for too long. "But first, you need to promise me one thing. What I'm about to tell you, you can't tell anyone." I nodded, though my heart was pounding. "I promise, Grandpa, tell me." And so he began. 5 years ago, during that hunting trip in Colorado, everything had been orchestrated. He hadn't gone alone, as the newspapers reported. Robert, my father, and Michael had gone with him. They said it would be a family bonding trip, he said, his voice bitter. But I had my suspicions. Robert had changed long before then. His ambition was greater than I'd ever imagined. He recounted how, in the cold forest, my father and Michael led him to a remote stream. They said they wanted to stop and rest, but then, in a moment he hadn't anticipated, they pushed him into a ravine. I fell, James. I fell hard. But I didn't die. A shepherd living nearby found me, took me to his cabin, and tended to my wounds. I sat there, gripping the edge of the table, feeling like the world was turning upside down. "Dad? And Michael?" I whispered. "They tried to kill you?" My grandfather nodded, his eyes darkening. "They thought I was dead. They needed me gone to take full control. Robert always wanted this company, James. He didn't just want to run it, he wanted to own it, to erase my name from Prescott Dynamics' legacy." My throat tightened, tears welling up. "But why didn't you come back right away? Why did you let us think you were dead?" He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip thin but still strong. "I needed time, James. Time to gather evidence. Time to make sure that when I return, Robert and Michael wouldn't be able to deny it. I spent 5 years in the shadows reaching out to old friends, people still loyal to me. I have recordings, emails, documents, all proving their conspiracy." I cried, not out of sadness, but out of anger, pain, and a faint spark of hope igniting within me. My grandfather was alive. He was here, right in front of me, and he needed me. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, wiping my tears with the back of my hand. "I'll do anything to make this right." He looked at me, his eyes brightening slightly. "James, you're the only one I trust. You haven't been blinded by power. You have your mother's heart and my resolve. I want you to help me expose the truth. But it won't be easy. Robert and Michael have influence, money, and they'll do anything to protect what they built." I nodded, though a storm of emotions raged inside me. "I'll do it, Grandpa. I'll help you." He smiled for the first time that night, and I saw the man I'd always admired, the one who taught me about honesty, responsibility, and standing up for what's right. "Good," he said, "but we need to be careful. Robert isn't a fool and Michael is even more dangerous. They can't know I'm back, not until we're ready." A few days later, my grandfather took me to his small house on the outskirts of Austin where he was hiding. It was a modest wooden cabin tucked behind old oak trees far from the city's bustle. He said he'd rented it through an intermediary to avoid detection. I still couldn't believe he was here, alive and breathing after 5 years of thinking he was gone forever. "James, there's one more person who needs to know the truth," he said, his voice lowering. "Your mother." I froze. "But you said not to tell anyone." He nodded. "I did. But Eleanor is my daughter. She deserves to know, and I'm worried about her health. She needs something to give her strength to carry on." I agreed, though I was still uneasy. My mother was so frail, both physically and emotionally. Would the fact that my grandfather was alive outweigh the pain of the truth about my father and Michael? I called my mother, telling her I wanted her to come to my apartment to talk. When she arrived, I gently explained that I had a special surprise and needed her to come with me. She looked at me, her eyes full of doubt, but she agreed. I drove her to the cabin, saying little on the way. She sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze distant. When we walked into the cabin, my grandfather was waiting in the living room. My mother saw him, and time seemed to stop. She froze, her lips trembling, then burst into tears. "Dad," she whispered, rushing into his arms. My grandfather held her tightly, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Eleanor, my daughter, I'm sorry for making you wait so long." I stood there watching them, feeling my heart break with both joy and pain. My mother sobbed as if all the grief of the past 5 years was pouring out. He told her everything, the hunting trip, the plot by my father and Michael, and the years he'd spent in hiding. My mother listened, her face shifting from shock to pain and finally to anger. "Robert," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. "He did this. To you." My grandfather took her hand. "Eleanor, I know this is hard to accept, but I need you to be strong. We're going to take back what belongs to this family, and James will help us." My mother turned to me, her eyes sparking with a determination I hadn't seen in years. "James, you're my hope. You have to do this." I nodded, feeling a new weight settle on my shoulders. This wasn't just my grandfather's fight. It was mine, my mother's, and the legacy my grandfather had built. In the days that followed, my grandfather and I began to plan. He showed me the evidence he'd collected over the past 5 years, emails between my father and Michael, recordings of their conversations, and documents proving the illegal transfer of Prescott Dynamics assets. Each piece of evidence was like a knife to the heart. I grew up in my father's arms, once admiring his intelligence and decisiveness. But now, I saw only a traitor. My grandfather contacted a legal team he trusted, old friends from his days running the company. They helped us verify his legal identity, ensuring that when he reappeared, no one could question that he was Henry Prescott. They also prepared documents to sue my father and Michael, accusing them of attempted murder, embezzlement, and destroying the company's legacy. Meanwhile, I secretly met with my mother every week, ensuring she was okay and not revealing any signs of my grandfather's return. She started eating better, and her eyes gradually regained their spark. "James, I've never felt so alive," she said during one visit. "Your grandfather is back, and I believe you'll do the right thing." But I couldn't deny the growing fear in my heart. My father and Michael were not to be underestimated. They had money, power, and people willing to do anything to protect them. If I failed, not only would my grandfather and mother be in danger, but I could lose everything. One evening, as my grandfather and I reviewed the documents, he suddenly stopped and looked at me with a serious expression. "James, I've rewritten my will," he said. "I've revoked all previous authorizations. All the assets, shares, and control of the company, I'm leaving them to you." I was stunned. "Grandpa, I'm not sure I can dash," he cut me off. "You can, James. You're the only one I trust. You'll bring Prescott Dynamics back to its rightful path. I believe in you." I didn't know what to say. The responsibility was immense, overwhelming. But looking into his eyes, I knew I couldn't refuse. This wasn't just about the company. It was about justice, about family, about righting the wrongs of the past. As I left the cabin that night, the rain had stopped, leaving a sky full of twinkling stars. I stood on the porch, breathing in the cool air, feeling a new strength coursing through my veins. My grandfather was back, and he had chosen me. I was no longer the outcast of the family. I was the one who would stand up, face my father and Michael, and bring the truth to light. But I knew the real battle was still ahead, and it wouldn't be easy. 2 weeks later, a white envelope arrived at my apartment. I picked it up from the doormat, surprised to see the words Anderson Global embossed on the paper. Inside was an invitation with handwritten lines in gold ink. You are cordially invited, James Anderson, to attend the family reunion celebrating the 5th anniversary of the successful transition from Prescott Dynamics to Anderson Global. Time, 7 p.m., November 15th. Location, Anderson Global Headquarters, Austin, Texas. I held the invitation, feeling as if it were burning my hand. A family reunion? Since when did my father and Michael care about including me? For 5 years they had pushed me out of everything, treating me like an outsider. Why were they inviting me now? I called my mother, the only person in the family I still trusted, to ask if she knew anything about this. James, I got an invitation to, she said over the phone, her voice frail but tinged with determination. I'm going, and you should too. This is our chance to do what needs to be done. I understood what she meant. She knew the truth about my grandfather, about my father and Michael's plot, and she wanted me to bring him to this event, not just for a reunion, but to expose everything. I went to my grandfather that same evening in the wooden cabin on the outskirts of town. He was sitting in an armchair, holding a cup of tea, his eyes lighting up when I told him about the invitation. This is our moment, James, he said, his voice low and resolute. Robert and Michael think they've won. They want to flaunt their victory in front of the media, the shareholders. But they don't know I'm back, and we're going to make them pay. I nodded, my heart pounding. But Grandpa, what if they suspect something? What if they find out about you before we're ready? He placed a hand on my shoulder, his gaze piercing through me. James, I survived 5 years in the shadows. I know how to keep a secret, and you're the one who will stand with me. We have the evidence, the truth, and Eleanor. We'll do this. In the days leading up to the event, my grandfather and I worked tirelessly. We met with the legal team he had contacted, a group of seasoned lawyers who had worked with him during Prescott Dynamics' heyday. They helped us organize the evidence, recordings of my father and Michael discussing their plan to eliminate my grandfather, emails detailing illegal transactions, and asset maps showing how they had unlawfully transferred company shares. Each piece of evidence was like a bullet, ready to be fired at the right moment. I also met with my mother in secret several times to ensure she was strong enough to face what was coming. She had changed since reuniting with my grandfather. She was no longer the frail, quiet woman I'd known. A small fire burned in her eyes, though I knew she was still pained by the thought of my father's betrayal. James, I'm not sure I want to do this, she said during one meeting at my apartment, her hands clasped tightly together. But I have to. For your grandfather. For you. And for myself. I hugged her, feeling the fragile but fierce determination within her. Mom, I'll be with you. Grandpa will be too. We'll get through this together. On the evening of November 15th, I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment, putting on a navy blue suit I rarely touched. I looked at myself, barely recognizing the man with cold eyes and tense shoulders. I was no longer James Anderson, the education consultant living a quiet life. I was James Anderson, the man who would walk into the lion's den, armed with the truth to bring down those who had betrayed my family. I drove to Anderson Global's headquarters, my heart pounding. The glass building glowed under the lights, the giant, a logo gleaming like a declaration of power. Inside, the main hall had been transformed into a lavish banquet room with long tables draped in white silk, sparkling wine glasses and soft jazz music playing from a live band. Shareholders, business partners, and media reporters mingled, laughing and clinking glasses. The air was thick with self-satisfaction, as if everyone believed Anderson Global was invincible. I walked in, feeling curious, and disdainful glances turned toward me. A few people whispered as I passed, "That's James, Robert's youngest son. I heard he doesn't work for the company, the oddball of the Anderson family." I ignored them all, searching for my mother in the crowd. She stood in a corner wearing a long emerald green dress, her eyes lighting up when she saw me. I approached, took her hand, and whispered, "Mom, Grandpa's ready." She nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. So am I, James. The event began with my father's speech. He stood at the podium, dressed in a sleek black suit, his voice booming through the sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, a confident smile on his lips. Today marks a significant milestone. 5 years ago, we transitioned from Prescott Dynamics to Andersen Global, and today we stand here as one of the world's leading conglomerates. This is the achievement of the Andersen family, of me, of my son Michael, and of all of you. The room erupted in applause. I stood in the corner clenching my fists. The Andersen family, he said, as if my mother and I didn't exist, as if my grandfather hadn't laid the foundation for everything they had. Michael took the podium next, continuing where my father left off. He looked impeccable in a gray suit, his hair neatly slicked back, his voice smooth like a politician's. Andersen Global is about to enter a new era, he declared. We are preparing for a global IPO, taking our company to the world stock markets. This is the moment to solidify our position not just in America, but across the globe. Another round of applause. My stomach churned. I glanced at my mother, seeing her grip her wine glass tightly, her eyes holding back a storm. I knew the moment had come. I left the room pretending to head to the restroom, but in reality, I went to meet my grandfather. He was waiting in a discreet hallway behind the building, dressed in a silver-gray suit leaning on a cane, his white hair neatly combed. Despite his age, he exuded an unmistakable presence, the presence of Henry Prescott, the founder of Prescott Dynamics. Are you ready, James? He asked, his eyes sharp. I took a deep breath. I'm ready, Grandpa. We walked into the room and immediately the atmosphere shifted, whispers rippled through the crowd, eyes turning toward us. I led the way, clearing a path for my grandfather. He walked slowly, but each step was like a declaration. When we reached the center of the room, my father and Michael were still at the podium, their faces shifting from smugness to shock. Ladies and gentlemen, I said loudly, my voice trembling with emotion but clear, I'd like to introduce someone we all thought was gone forever, Mr. Henry Prescott, the founder of Prescott Dynamics. The room fell silent. Some jaws dropped. Others stood up in shock. My father froze, the wine glass in his hand trembling. Michael paled, his eyes burning into me. My grandfather stepped onto the podium, leaning on his cane, but his posture was as upright as an oak. I am Henry Prescott, he said, his voice resonating through the room. And I'm not dead. 5 years ago, I was betrayed by the people I trusted most. Robert Andersen and Michael Andersen staged an accident to eliminate me, to seize this company. Murmurs erupted like waves. I looked at my father, seeing him struggle to maintain his composure, but his lips were pressed tightly together, and I knew he was panicking. Michael stepped forward, his voice sharp. What is this charade? That man cannot be Henry Prescott, he's dead. My grandfather smiled a cold smile. Robert, Michael, did you think I wouldn't return? Did you think you could erase my name, steal my legacy, and live in peace? He signaled to me. I stepped forward carrying a small projector the legal team had prepared. A large screen was lowered, and I began presenting the evidence we had gathered. First came the recording, my father and Michael's voices unmistakable discussing pushing my grandfather into the ravine. He won't survive. My father's voice rang out, cold and ruthless. We'll say it was an accident. The room went silent. Some shareholders covered their mouths, eyes wide with horror. I continued displaying emails between my father and a local politician discussing the illegal transfer of Prescott Dynamics shares. Finally, I showed the asset map, revealing millions of dollars funneled offshore through shell companies. My mother stood up from her seat, her face streaked with tears but her voice strong. Robert, what have you done to my father? She walked to the podium facing my father. You tried to kill my father. You betrayed me, betrayed this family. My father stepped back, his face pale. Eleanor, you don't understand. This is a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? My mother's voice broke with fury. My father and I always believed in you, supported you in every way when you first came to America. And you tried to murder my father. You're a wolf in sheep's clothing, ungrateful. Michael tried to interject, his voice trembling. Everyone, this is a conspiracy. That man is not Henry Prescott. He's an imposter. But my grandfather was prepared. He produced identification documents verified by the legal team and a short video from the shepherd in Colorado who had saved him 5 years ago. I am Henry Prescott, he said again, his voice like thunder. And I've returned to take back what belongs to me, to my family, to Prescott Dynamics. The room erupted in murmurs like a wave breaking after being held back too long. Some shareholders stood, their voices rising in outrage demanding an immediate investigation. Reporters swarmed like vultures, cameras flashing, capturing every moment. But then the noise stopped abruptly as the main doors of the room swung open and a group of uniformed police officers walked in, sidearms holstered, their cold gazes sweeping the crowd. I stood frozen, my heart pounding. They had arrived faster than I expected. My grandfather's legal team had been quietly working with the FBI in the days leading up to this, and now the moment of justice had come. A tall, stern-faced police chief stepped onto the podium, raising a hand for silence. "Robert Anderson, Michael Anderson," he said, his voice resounding like a verdict. "You are under arrest for charges of conspiracy to commit murder, embezzlement, and financial fraud." The room fell silent. I looked at my father, seeing him step back, his face pale, his hands trembling. Michael tried to bolt for a side door, but two officers blocked him, grabbing his arms. The click of handcuffs echoed, sharp like a blade cutting through the air. My father tried to maintain his composure, but as the cuffs tightened around his wrists, I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. Something I'd never seen in the man who was always so confident. "You're making a mistake," Michael shouted, his voice cracking with anger and fear. "This is a conspiracy. That man is not Henry Prescott." But no one listened. The shareholders watched in shock, some covering their mouths, eyes wide with horror. My mother stood in the corner, clutching her dress, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to run to her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't move. I stood there watching my father and Michael being led out of the room, amid the flashing cameras and the jeers of the crowd. As the doors closed behind them, a heavy silence settled over the room. A sharp pain stabbed at my chest. This was my father, the man who taught me how to tie my shoes when I was 5. This was Michael, the brother who carried me on his shoulders through summer fields. Now they were being led away like criminals, and I didn't know how to feel, angry, heartbroken, or relieved. My grandfather raised a hand, signaling for silence. The room quieted, all eyes turning to him. His voice rang out steady and unyielding like a mountain that could not be shaken. "Today we have witnessed the truth, but the truth is not just for exposing, it's for rebuilding. I have drafted a new will. All my authority, shares, and assets will be transferred to my grandson, James Anderson. He is the only one in this family who has not been blinded by power. He will lead Prescott Dynamics back to its rightful path." I felt my blood run cold. Every eye in the room turned to me, curious, skeptical, and a few filled with hope. I wanted to say something, to protest, to say I wasn't worthy, that I wasn't ready. But my throat tightened, as if gripped by an invisible hand. I wasn't the man my grandfather described, the strong, decisive leader ready to take on an empire. I was just James, the education consultant who liked quiet mornings and old books. The responsibility he'd placed on my shoulders felt like a mountain, and I wasn't sure I could carry it. I looked at my mother. Her eyes shone with a determination I hadn't seen in years. She nodded at me as if saying she believed in me. I looked at my grandfather, seeing his sharp but trusting gaze, and in that moment I knew I couldn't turn back. Not because I wanted power, but because I wanted justice. For my grandfather, for my mother, and for myself. I stepped onto the podium, my legs heavy but unwavering. I took a deep breath, trying to quell the storm of emotions inside me. "I don't promise to be perfect," I said, my voice trembling but clear, echoing through the room. "But I promise to do everything I can to bring Prescott Dynamics back to what my grandfather built. A company of integrity, responsibility, and a future." The room was silent for a moment, then a few people began to clap. The applause spread, growing into a thunderous ovation. I looked at my mother, seeing her smile through her tears. I looked at my grandfather, seeing him nod, his eyes shining with pride. And in that moment, I knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead would be, I wouldn't walk it alone. The next morning, Austin was shaken to its core. Major newspapers, from the New York Times to the Austin Chronicle, ran headlines screaming Prescott Dynamics founder returns from the dead, accuses son-in-law and grandson of murder plot. Images of my grandfather standing tall at the podium with a steely gaze flooded social media. Videos from the family reunion spread like wildfire, accompanied by the chilling audio of my father and Michael coldly discussing how to eliminate him. The world was ablaze, and Anderson Global, the name my father and Michael had so proudly built, was now at the center of a shocking scandal. The FBI acted swiftly. Just hours after the event, my grandfather's legal team handed over all the evidence to the authorities. Federal agents raided Anderson Global's headquarters, sealing off offices and seizing computers and documents. My father and Michael's personal assets, from their mansion in the Austin suburbs to their offshore bank accounts, were frozen. I heard from an old friend at the company that my father had tried to call his personal lawyer, but no one would take the case. They know Robert and Michael don't stand a chance, my friend said, his voice tinged with regret. The evidence is too clear, James. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted justice, wanted my father and Michael to pay for what they'd done. But another part, the son, the brother, ached at the thought of them in handcuffs led away under the world's gaze. I tried to push those thoughts out of my mind, but they clung to me like shadows that wouldn't let go. In the weeks that followed, the media turned my family's story into a sensational drama. Talk shows brought in commentators to dissect every detail, from the fateful hunting trip in Colorado to my grandfather's years in hiding. Some tabloids even fabricated stories claiming he had lived in a cave or become a hermit. I wanted to laugh when I read those articles, but my laughter was bitter. The truth was painful enough without their embellishments. My mother became the center of attention, though she didn't want it. Reporters swarmed her house, trying to snap photos through the windows, attempting to interview her about her traitorous husband. I had to hire security to keep them at bay, shielding her from the relentless media hounding. My grandfather, on the other hand, handled the attention with remarkable calm. He agreed to an exclusive interview with a reputable newspaper, recounting his story concisely but with undeniable weight. I didn't come back for fame or power, he said on television, his eyes fixed on the camera. I came back for justice and for the people I love. His words were like a flame, igniting hope in the hearts of those who had once worked for Prescott Dynamics. Many former employees fired by my father and Michael reached out to me, expressing their desire to return. They called me Henry's heir, though I felt unprepared for such a title. The trial of my father and Michael dragged on for nearly 6 months, but the outcome was inevitable. The FBI, with the support of my grandfather's legal team, built an airtight case. Conspiracy to commit murder, embezzlement of millions of dollars, money laundering through shell companies, and the destruction of Prescott Dynamics' legacy. The trial was closely followed by the media with new headlines every day. Son-in-law betrays Henry Prescott. Michael Anderson faces life in prison. I didn't attend the trial. I couldn't. The thought of sitting there, watching my father and Michael behind the defendant's stand, listening to them justify their crimes made me feel suffocated. But my mother went despite my attempts to stop her. I need to see it with my own eyes, James, she said. I need to know justice has been served. When the verdict came, she called me, her voice trembling but calm. Robert was sentenced to 20 years for conspiracy to commit murder and embezzlement, she said. Michael got 15 years for complicity and financial fraud. They won't be out anytime soon, James. I sank into a chair, gripping the phone tightly. Mom, are you okay? I asked, though I knew the answer. She was silent for a moment, then said, I'm okay, but I need time. I understood. I needed time, too. I wasn't happy about their sentencing, but I wasn't as sad as I thought I'd be. Perhaps I'd lost them long ago, the day they chose to betray my grandfather, to betray our family. But the pain lingered, like a scar that would never fully heal. Entrusted by my grandfather, I officially took over Anderson Global, or rather restored it to its original name, Prescott Dynamics. The day I signed the decision to change the name, I stood in the company's main boardroom staring at the cold, a logo on the wall. Take it down, I told the staff, my voice steadier than I felt. We're bringing Prescott Dynamics back. The overhaul wasn't easy. My father and Michael had left a mess. Shady contracts, environmentally damaging projects, and a workforce that had lost faith. I worked day and night with a team of advisors my grandfather recommended, canceling projects that didn't align with the company's values. We pulled out of the Alaska oil drilling project, reinvested in clean energy, and committed to transparent transactions. I rehired former employees who had been loyal to my grandfather, listening to their ideas on how to steer the company back on track. But the hardest part wasn't the work. It was the internal pressure. Every day I faced the question of whether I was capable of carrying my grandfather's legacy. Some nights I sat alone in my office, staring at an old photo of him on the wall, asking myself, Grandpa, am I doing this right? One time lost in those thoughts, my mother came to the office. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her gaze gentle but firm. James, you don't have to be perfect, she said. You just have to be honest, like your grandfather. That's all Prescott Dynamics needs. Her words were like a cool breeze, easing some of my doubts. I began to believe I could do it, not because I was exceptional, but because I had my mother and grandfather by my side, and because I believed in the values my grandfather had passed down. During a board meeting, I proposed an idea I'd been nurturing for a long time, a nonprofit fund named after my mother, the Eleanor Foundation. It would support women who had been deceived and hurt in marriage, providing counseling, financial aid, and opportunities to rebuild their lives. I thought of my mother, of the years she lived in the shadow of betrayal, and I wanted to ensure no one else had to endure what she had. When I presented the idea, some shareholders were skeptical. "James, we've just gone through a crisis," one said. "Is this really the time to invest in a charitable fund?" I looked him in the eye, my voice calm but resolute. Prescott Dynamics isn't just about profit, it's about people. And if we don't help those who need us, we're no different from Anderson Global. The room fell silent. Then one person clapped, then another. Eventually, the entire board agreed. The Eleanor Foundation was born, and when my mother heard the news, she hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her face. "James, you've made me proud," she said. "This is what I've always wanted. Something good amidst all this pain." One spring afternoon, I drove my mother to Colorado, where my grandfather had chosen to spend the rest of his days. He didn't return to running Prescott Dynamics despite my attempts to persuade him. "James, I've done my part," he said gently. "Now it's your time. I just want to live in peace, in the place that saved me." His house sat in a small valley surrounded by snow-capped mountains. It was a simple log cabin with smoke rising from the chimney and a small garden he tended himself. When we arrived, he was sitting on the porch reading an old book, his eyes lighting up when he saw my mother. "Eleanor," he called, standing to embrace her. I stood watching, my heart warmed. My mother decided to stay with him at least for a while to heal the wounds in her heart. As I drove away from the valley, I glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing my mother and grandfather standing side by side, their figures shrinking under the sunset. I knew they would be okay, and so would I. Prescott Dynamics began to revive. Our clean energy projects attracted new investors drawn to my grandfather's comeback story and my commitment to ethical business. The Eleanor Foundation grew rapidly, supporting hundreds of women across the country. Each thank you letter from them was a reminder that I was on the right path. I no longer dreamed of my grandfather covered in wounds. Instead, I dreamed of the grassy fields where Michael and I used to play as kids, where my father once laughed heartily and held me close. Those dreams no longer woke me in a cold sweat. They reminded me that despite a painful past, I could build a better future. I stood in my office at Prescott Dynamics looking out at Austin's twinkling lights under the night sky. On my desk was a photo of my grandfather, my mother, and me taking the day I officially became the company's chairman. I was no longer the outcast. I was James Anderson, heir to Henry Prescott's legacy, bearer of my mother's hope, and determined to rebuild from the ashes of the past. The road ahead was still long, but I wasn't afraid. I had my mother, my grandfather, and myself, a stronger James ready to face any challenge. And somewhere deep in my heart, I knew justice had been served, not just for my family, but for everything Prescott Dynamics stood for.